So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Inshallah, today we're going to be completing with Fiqh al-Ibadat, the different chapters, of course, that relate to nawaqid al-wudu and what nullifies wudu, and a number of different things, inshallah, hopefully we'll be finishing. Let's see, nawaqid al-wudu, and then the different rulings that relate to ghusl. Ghusl is basically to make the complete shower in a state of major impurity. And we said that major impurity requires ghusl. And to make the story short, we said major impurity, such as number one, finishing period, finishing postpartum, or completing the days of postpartum, and number three, in a state of janaba, which is after sexual relations or at least after reaching the climax, whether that was due to a wet dream or whether that was through sexual relations or whether through things like masturbation. So that would mean that the person is in a state of major impurity until they take a shower. But a minor impurity requires wudu, which would basically be for probably doing defecation or urination or passing wind, sleeping. So those would be the things that would nullify the wudu, and therefore you would have to do wudu, or it would be considered a minor impurity, and you would have to do wudu. But are those the only things that I had just mentioned? I would say that's more of a summary. So let's go in details with that. Of course, there are certain things that would be considered as a direct wudu breaker, in where the direct wudu breaker, usually the things that leave the two exits. So let's consider it the two exits, in where what we mean by the two exits, basically the area where urine is basically exited, or even the area where, of course, feces are exited. So this is basically considered as to al-kharij min as-sabilain, what actually leaves the two pathways. So some scholars actually regarded that when we say whatever leaves the two pathways, that those are the two pathways. But of course, women have three pathways, because you've got the place that where urine exits, you've got the place where feces exits, and of course you basically have the place where the period exits. So those are the three different areas. So in other words, women actually have two. All right. So in situations where you might have actually done any of those, that would be considered a direct wudu breaker. But the things that are not a direct wudu breaker, but it can basically be something that may lead to having your wudu break, such as an indirect, of course, wudu breaker, such as a person losing their mind, going into a coma, probably going into some state of probably insanity, a moment where they basically just lost their ability to focus, their ability to understand. They went into anesthesia, anything of that sort. Then in that situation, that person is considered to have lost their wudu with an indirect wudu breaker. And of course, when we're speaking about, for more clarification, what is the evidence? What is the clarification in terms of that? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala generally stated the word أَوْ أَحَدٌ مِّنكُم مِّنَ الْغَائِطِ, if any of you come from the place of relieving himself. Now, at the time, they didn't really have these public bathrooms, or at least bathrooms. So what they used to do was they used to go to a place, a low area within, I guess, the community, and this low area would be considered a place where it was like a public bathroom. They would do their business, call of nature, dig up a hole, and then just bury it, basically. That was their public bathroom. And of course, just imagine every single day that you needed to use the bathroom, you had to basically go for a walk and get to that place, and basically, just prepare yourself prepare yourself that this really is kind of like a journey that you have to take every single day, a couple times, or at least, hey, what if you were actually diabetic? Man, that would really be a problem. All right, let's continue. So the things that leave the place of exit, such as basically urine or even of course, feces or anything that leaves those exits. I want you to focus with me here because when you're talking about any different any different type of, whether it's a discharge or anything that leaves that area, would actually be considered in general. So that's the first opinion. The first opinion is that since it's leaving and exiting that area, that would actually make it as an impurity just on the spot, an impurity just on the spot. So in other words, whether we're speaking about what is called medhi, or whether we're calling it, of course, um, urine, or whether this is called istihada, or whether this is called wind. They said right there, just it coming from that exit or these exits, then that would actually mean it's a wudu breaker. Just a note on the side. Some scholars actually considered it, let's say, a wider thing. Let's say a person was having hemorrhoids, they were bleeding, all right? Or let's say the person had some kind of an illness. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us all healing, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us all good health. Let's say there was pus. Let's say something even different than pus. Let's say parasites, etc. All these different things. Some scholars actually regarded that just because it is exiting this area of opening in the body, that automatically makes it a wudu breaker. If the person was having an uncontrollable release of such wudu breakers, then in that situation, the first opinion is that they just do wudu for every salah, even if such an uncontrollable wudu breaker that is right now really being released, and of course, um, not voluntarily, then in that situation, the first opinion regards that they would just do wudu for every salah. The second opinion, which is Maliki, they regarded, well, if the same reason is constantly there, and of course, for the Maliki opinion, they said, regardless of what wudu breaker that is, if they're constantly having the same reason, then in that situation, that would be considered as really, regardless of having a new time for the salah, then they don't really have to consider it as a wudu breaker from the beginning, because anyways, they did do their wudu for the first time. They're just having the same exact reason just continuously take place. So regardless of a new timing for prayer or an old timing for prayer, it's going to be the same thing. Just wanted to note that one. So for that was the second opinion, is basically really coming in handy. Pay attention with me here, because you could actually have, elderly that can probably go through dialysis or probably go through, some hardship in where it's really hard for her to constantly do wudu, or maybe a sister just had a C-section, and it would, even though they do definitely encourage her to go to the bathroom, urinate, and just basically clear out the pathway and change the pads because of the bleeding, etc. But it can happen that sometimes they would definitely encourage, let's just of course, because she would be on postpartum anyways at that time, but let's just assume that it was something that was similar, in where she basically had right there a surgery. Okay, forget about postpartum, but had a surgery, and she was having istihada anyways. and she wanted to pray, would we actually recommend for her to basically get up and constantly do wudu? Or can we say, well, there is a differences of opinions in where just because of the bleeding of istihada that she does not have to keep doing her wudu over and over again. So this is a considerable opinion, but of course, if she were to urinate, for example, or if she were to have another wudu breaker, then she would have to redo her wudu. And there are different ways in case of necessity in where those circumstances that can be really hard, in where they can do what is called combining the prayers in those exceptional situations, whether it's an illness or whether because of a hardship, etc. And when we say because of an illness, whether we're talking about, let's say, delaying the process of healing, or whether we're speaking about making the illness worse. Okay, so whether it's delaying the process or making the illness worse, those situations, the person can combine the prayers to mean Dhuhr and Asr together, Maghrib and Isha together, and that way we will basically be reducing the number of wudu renewal. All right, let's continue right there. So if the wudu breaker was not of something that is considered urine, or basically let's call them the pathways, then just the idea of anything exiting, of course, the body, that would be considered as impure. Now, for the things that are such as sperm or pre-seminal fluid, let me explain the part about pre-seminal fluid. All right. So for sperm, of course, if we're speaking about an actual ejaculation, then in that situation, that would be a major impurity. So whether the ejaculation happened during a wet dream, or whether it happened during intercourse, or whether it happened during foreplay, or whether it happened during, or maybe let's say, masturbation, regardless of what the ruling of masturbation is, then in that situation, that is a major impurity, and the person is required to make ghusl, i.e., a complete body wash. The pre-seminal fluid is basically another word for basically methi. Now, methi is different than many. Pre-seminal fluid is different than the actual ejaculation, because the pre-seminal fluid, even the fluid itself, is actually a different substance. Let's talk about the male part and the female part in order to explain the difference. So the pre-seminal fluid, it basically is a fluid that the body releases. Of course, with men, it's usually less than it is for women. The pre-seminal fluid, it basically does not come with an ejaculation. The sperm, or at least, of course, when we're talking about the semen, all right, semen itself actually comes with an ejaculation, in where it's a white fluid, white milky fluid, but the methi, the pre-seminal fluid, is not a white milky fluid. Rather, it is a clear fluid that comes with lust. So due to lust, that is basically discharged, of course, and therefore the pre-seminal fluid requires just washing the area, including the testicles, and making wudu over again, not complete shower. Yet, ejaculation, which basically produces semen, requires ghusl. As for women, the pre-seminal, even though it would basically, all right, more of, let's just call it medhi, the medhi for women basically is a fluid. It's a clear fluid, sticky fluid, and of course, the that fluid is basically supposed to be making it easy for relationships, for, of course, for intercourse. So in that situation, that fluid, how do I know if it is madhi or wadi? Wadi actually is produced by the body during defecation or during urination. But madhi is actually produced when there is lust, when there's an arousal. All right. When there's an arousal, this is called madhi. But semen, or for a woman which reaching the climax, that would be produced when there is an actual pulse. In other words, reach the climax. When reaching the climax, whether due to intercourse or whether due to masturbation or whether due, of course, to a wet dream, then in that situation, that requires ghusl. It is considered a major impurity. But if it, how do I know? It's usually harder to tell for a woman if we're just looking at the substance. The easiest way for a woman is basically, do you recognize that there was a pulse? What if she was sleeping? In that situation, we would say, well, if there's an arousal that you had basically sensed, then in that situation, we would basically, if it's a dream, we would basically consider it as a wet dream, and therefore you would have to make a complete shower. If it is not not a complete arousal, or at least a complete, let's say, getting to the climax, and it was just an arousal, then in that situation it would be considered within the category of madhi, and therefore requiring just renewing the wudu, including washing the private part called istinja. All right. What is the evidence in terms of, at least when we're speaking about istihada? What is istihada? So istihada, just keep it in this category. You've got three different types of bleedings that are discharged from the vaginal area for women. You've got, it is either postpartum or it is a period. If it's a period, it's basically an unfertilized egg. And if it's a postpartum, it basically is after a pregnancy that is 10 weeks and above, or at least, if you don't know how many weeks, if the embryo that basically was either aborted or a miscarriage happened, if this embryo has human features, then in that situation, this pregnancy that was terminated, whether it is an induced termination or whether, let's call it, the body terminating the pregnancy, it would basically be the same ruling. If it is, let's say, 10 weeks and above, then in that situation, the bleeding that comes after the release of that, let's call it miscarriage or abortion, then in that situation, that bleeding would be considered postpartum. And as long as she is bleeding for 40 or 60 days, differences of opinions between scholars, that would be considered basically a postpartum, a major impurity, which does not necessarily get removed by a shower, but until the bleeding stops. Of course, some scholars had said until 40 days, and some had said until 60. But if at any time, or let's say at any day, to make it clearer, if at any day that bleeding stops, and of course she's not bleeding anymore and not spotting anymore, then in that situation, she would be considered that her postpartum ended. If within the 40 days the bleeding comes back, then in that situation, she would consider when the day on the day that her bleeding came back during the 40 days of postpartum, that's basically considered that she is still within her postpartum. What about the days that she had prayed in? She did the same, she did the right thing when she was not bleeding during those days, basically took the shower when she stopped getting the bleeding and basically continued to pray. Now, I can see that there's a question. Um, okay, wanted to hear her lecture. Okay, okay, Nura, what do you want me to do? I'm confused. I'm here, but Nura, you can go to her. I mean, that's absolutely fine. All right. Um, so let's continue. In terms of, so we're talking about here, of course, we're talking about postpartum, but there's also dam al-istihada, in where al-istihada is actually different than a period. I mean, period is really direct and really straightforward, in where basically a monthly cycle. All right, we're going to talk about period later on, but istihada is any bleeding, any vaginal bleeding that is not a period and not a postpartum. So, with the vaginal bleeding, whether that was because um, had fibrosis or had cysts or a surgery or some, I guess, did some kind of a vaginal ultrasound, even though it shouldn't be really causing any bleeding, but there's these circumstances that basically it can happen, all right, in where if we're talking about, I guess, the lining of the uterus being too thin or uh, too sensitive, in where vaginal ultrasound caused them to bleed in that situation. So that would be considered istihada. So for istihada, it would be considered exactly like you were to have a finger cut, a nosebleed, in where the Prophet ﷺ told the Sahabiya Fatima bint Abi Hubaysh, he told her, فتوضئي وصلي فإنما هو عرق. He told her, perform wudu, ablution, and then you can offer prayer, for it's only due to a vein. I want you to look at the word vein right here. So when you look at when he said vein, that's basically to say it's exactly like any other cut that you would actually have on your body. And of course, when we look at that piece of it, that would basically mean just fatawadda'i wasalli. Just renew your wudu, just make a wudu and just pray. In other words, don't let that bleeding basically take away your focus or prevent you from prayer, which actually means by the imperative verb fatawadda'i that she would actually be obligated to pray during istihada. So it's not an optional thing, but it's actually a mandatory thing, in where we have to basically really take that salah seriously, and we cannot necessarily consider it as, oh, it's an extra thing to do. It's obligatory. You're mandated. What if she was tired? What if this? So at the end of the day, is that if there are exceptional cases, she cannot leave salah, but she would, if she's not capable of redoing wudu for every salah, then she can combine the prayers, Dhuhr and Asr together, Maghrib and Aisha together. And what if it was too tiring for her? She can't get off the bed, etc. She can do it while she's lying on the bed, or she's sitting down if it's hard for her to get up. So basically like a person that is ill. All right. What about the part about wind? What is the evidence that if a person passes wind, that they have to redo their wudu at least? Number one is that the Prophet ﷺ actually said, لا يقبل الله صلاة أحدكم إذا أحدث حتى يتوضأ. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not accept the prayer of anybody until إذا أحدث, if they basically go into an impurity, until they perform wudu. So one should not leave prayer unless they basically hear a sound or smell something. All right. So in that situation, if a person We're speaking about their hearing crackling in their stomach, they're feeling bloated. Just because the person is feeling bloated, it doesn't mean that they have to redo that doesn't mean that they have to basically uh, uh, leave their salah just because they're bloated. It basically just means that they would wait until they are sure that an actual passing of gas had actually happened, whether through hearing the sound or whether basically smelling something. In other words, until you are really sure. So let's go for the other things that scholars had talked about outside of, let's say, the private exits. Let's call them private exits, as instead of kharij min as-sabilayn and two pathways, and then it becomes too ambiguous for some. All right, let's just call them the non-private. All right, the non-private exits, such as bleeding, vomiting, having a nosebleed. There are differences of opinions between scholars on these basically categories, such as having a bleeding. Let's say you get a cut, or of course, severe bleeding, or whether the person had involuntary or voluntary induced a vomit. Does that break your wudu or not? Just a note, I'm not going to go in lots of details in that regards, but scholars actually had differences of opinions whether this is something that is considered a wudu breaker or not. Let's see, here's a sister asking a question regarding taking a ghusl after, for example, a wet dream. If the parents were shy themselves and didn't teach the kids to take ghusl, in this case, what should be done? What should be done is basically teach them to do ghusl, and there's nothing to be shy about. This is an absolute physical thing, body thing. It has nothing to do with feeling shy because you're not guilty whatsoever. This is basically your body doing its course in order to basically continue, instead of keeping all of these different fluids and secretions in your body. Your body does these, whether it's a wet dream, or basically does these discharges because it secreted these fluids, and therefore for it to stay within your body, it becomes an illness. It becomes something that is basically harmful onto your body. So your body does a certain course to release it outside of your body. All right. So this is not to be shy about whatsoever. It's basically exactly like you would have a different basically course within your body, and this is basically part of being an adult, part of being or reaching the age of puberty. So there's nothing to be shy about. And certainly, even if, of course, their children are now considered have reached the age of puberty, it's important that the parents would teach them and give them the space that I'm not going to basically judge you here, that I recognize that there are certain changes in the body and that you have to make your ghusl when necessary. So you would have to teach your children once they reach the age of puberty that this is mandatory. There's nothing to be shy about. All right. Um, all right. So the other part is things like sleeping, or things like going into a coma, or things like, let's say, the person, not necessarily a coma per se, but went through surgery, anesthesia, or any form of a person losing their mind. In that situation, basically the wudu is considered as broken, or at least void, not because of the actual the actual thing that happened, but as a result of a possibility that they were unconscious when the actual wudu breaker did happen. So let's say a person goes into a surgery, they made wudu, went into surgery, not just any anesthesia. We're not talking about dental anesthesia here. We're actually talking a complete body anesthesia. We're not talking about halfway, all right? We're talking about a complete body anesthesia. And in that situation, because of a possibility that they might have passed gas, they might have had some discharge and they didn't know about it. And in that situation, they would consider that that was a wudu breaker. Let's look at other things such as eating camel's meat. I want you to look at this one because with eating camel's meat, there are differences of opinions on whether camel meat actually breaks wudu or not. There's a huge debate. It's rather a strange debate, to be honest. Sometimes I feel that some debates are rather strange, and I think I would probably say this is also one of the strange ones. In maybe the stranger ones is the one in regards to semen, on whether semen is tahir, on whether it is pure or impure. They went into this huge debate. Is it pure? Is it impure? I mean, during our times, it's so easy to just remove your bed sheet and just go wash it. And you'll probably even be disgusted to not wash your bed sheet. But at the end of the day, just having that in mind, just knowing that there are differences of opinions between scholars and the debate between them is rather, I would say, funny sometimes. All right. Same thing when we're talking about eating camel's meat, on whether it's a wudu breaker or not, simply because of these two ahadith. So these two ahadith, the first one is a story where the Sahaba basically were praying together in a congregational prayer. Abdullah ibn Maktoum was a blind man. So he comes, and of course, being blind, doesn't recognize that there was a ditch in the ground or something of that sort, basically trips and falls in it. It seemed like some Sahaba thought it was funny, but other Sahaba really didn't think it was funny. And they were in the middle of Salah. The Sahaba that thought it was funny, they were in Salah and actually started laughing. The Prophet ﷺ, after completing Salah, told them whoever ate camel's meat that they should make their renew their wudu and renew their salah. Another narration where the Prophet ﷺ said, ألا من ضحك منكم قهقهة فليعد الصلاة والوضوء جميعا. Whoever laughed in a loud voice, that they should redo their salah and redo their wudu as well. So the different instances of redoing because of the hadith saying you laughed in a loud laugh, then you should redo your wudu and salah. The second hadith, in where if you had eaten camel's meat, that you should redo your wudu and redo basically your tahara in that situation. Some scholars regarded these two incidents as, well, this is a literal thing. And therefore, if a person were to laugh in a loud way, then therefore, or eat a camel's meat, then therefore the hadith literally said that that's what you have to do. Therefore, that's what you really need to do. You need to redo your wudu and redo your salah, even if you had laughed in a loud voice. Other scholars, they understood that there was a motive, that there was a disciplining reason behind all of this, and it was not necessarily a wudu breaker. They said when the Prophet ﷺ said whoever laughed in a loud laughter, that they should redo their wudu and their salah in order to discipline them, that don't laugh at a person because they had fallen in a ditch. And especially if he's a person that is disabled. What is funny about that? To train you, to discipline you, you're going to redo your wudu and redo your salah so that you would recognize how to hold yourself from laughing at a disabled person. Okay, this is one interpretation. The second interpretation, in regards to wudu, they said it was not related to the actual food that was consumed, but it was actually related to a behavior. In other words, it was really to discipline them. All right, let's talk about another issue. Oh, what is the preponderant ruling? Well, whenever we have differences of opinions, there is something called al-khuruju min al-khilafi awla. What does that mean? Al-khuruju min al-khilafi awla. I'm going to write it down. Al-khuruju min al-khilafi awla. So basically means min al-khilafi awla. Basically means whenever we have differences of opinions between scholars, staying away and being on the safe side is always our priority. So, in terms of if you are capable of washing and redoing your wudu, well, that would basically keep you on the safer opinion. But is it a wudu breaker? Is eating camel's meat a wudu breaker? Wallahu a'lam, the preponderant is that eating camel's meat is not a wudu breaker. It is important to mention that some scholars, they basically, especially the Hanbali, they basically had considered that eating camel's meat is different than any other meat. So this is not talking about goat meat, and this is not talking about beef, but this is talking about basically camel meat. They did consider that camel meat, it basically has some kind of an effect on the body that we need to cool it down and all of that. They had different interpretations. There are some scholars on the note, so this is not some fake Islam right there, but there are some scholars that actually considered that if a person were to eat proteins or things like meat, any type of meat, في كل ما مست النار, anything that basically is cooked, especially if we're talking about grilled, barbecued. There are some scholars that actually said that you have to redo your wudu because of, let's say, having not just any cooked foods, but we're talking about foods that basically things like barbecue, things like grill, etc., that basically requires that you would take away that, of course, the influence or the impact of protein on the body, the heat of it, etc. Some scholars did mention that, and there is a hadith in regards to that. So I'm just going to go to the at least what scholars had a stronger opinion about rather than go into these details, these little details. All right, let's continue. There is a question. What about touching the private part? We're not talking about masturbation here, but we're just talking about touching the private part, or whether touching women, or washing the dead, or leaving Islam and coming back to it, whether each and every single one of these nullifies the person's tahara or not. Just wanted to mention these and where there are differences of opinion. So, what do we mean by, let's say, touching the private part? So, touching the private part, especially, I guess, a man's private part is rather, let's say, um, more visual and more, let's say, more not hidden, and it's easier to actually touch. And I mean, sorry, but let's say the person is getting dressed, of course, to actually have your hand basically that, or the man's hand basically touching while they're getting dressed, etc. So just to note, there are differences of opinions between scholars in that regard. Wallahu alam, it is not a wudu breaker because the Prophet ﷺ actually said it is part of your body. So in that situation, it's not a wudu breaker. Let's say the person is getting dressed while, of course, they took a shower, they're getting dressed, and they're trying to basically get themselves dressed, etc. Then in that situation, just by your hand or the man's hand basically touching his own organ, that does not nullify the wudu. The part about touching women, that one is rather interesting because of the ayah. What is the ayah saying? Well, the ayah basically says, let's go back to the ayah. Is it where, maybe I could find you the ayah really quick so you could actually see that ayah. Oh no, I hope we don't go too far away from it. I want you to see it so you could actually picture how that ayah is actually relating to it. All right. Oh boy. Okay, here we go. We're getting there. Okay, we're getting there. Don't worry about it. Okay, is it here? No, I'm just trying to get you to the ayah. يا أيها الذين آمنوا إذا قمتم إلى الصلاة. No, not this one. Oh boy. Oh no, we're going too far. And now I'm going to be stuck. Okay. Oh well. All right. So basically, the ayah wanted to really show it to you, but looks like I probably might have missed it. But anyhow, so the ayah basically says that if you were to basically lose your wudu in case of situation of coming from al-gha'at, which is that low area, which is, we're talking about the low area to mean that public bathroom that they basically used to have, and whether they touch women, that they would basically have to redo their wudu, and basically the ayah would give the details of how wudu is done. So some scholars actually considered that when this ayah says lamastum nisa, I want you to look at the word. I'm going to write down the word, even though I can't, you can't see it, but I'll just write it down right there. All right, here we go. You can see the blue thing that I'm writing, right? So you could look at the word lamastum nisa, which is basically the word that is mentioned in the ayah. أو لامستم النساء فلم تجدوا ماء فتيمموا. In that ayah basically says lamastum. So the first group of scholars, they said, well, that is right there. They said la ma'sa actually means to touch. So some madhab, like the Shafi'i madhab, they basically considered if a man were to touch a woman, even if that was with no lust, even if she's basically giving him a towel and basically they somehow, just touch, and this is irrelevant to shaking hands, okay? Just the body touching a woman, whether she's mahram, whether she's not mahram, the Shafi'i madhab regarded that that's enough to break his wudu. Okay, what's the evidence? They said the word lamastum, and the word lamasa, which is this root, basically means to touch, and therefore they said, here we go, here's our evidence. The word is literally saying lamastum, literally saying the word to touch, therefore it is a wudu breaker. The Hanafi madhab, they said absolutely not. Not just because of a touch like that. What's the evidence? They said, look at the word. It says lamastum. And they said, well, you see that alif right there? Yeah, what about it? They said in Lugha Arabiya, that alif right there is to basically mean that there is a mutual bilateral type of touching, or that basically is an involvement, an exaggeration in the touching, which is a metaphor to actually mean intercourse. So this was basically, according to the Hanafi madhab, they said this is talking about an exaggerated touch in where, referring to intercourse, that's what would basically be considered a wudu breaker, meaning a person going into a major impurity. But then they said, well, they responded, and of course the other scholars, they said, well, what can you do? Remember, la masa means to touch. They said, well, yes, la masa means to touch, but the Quran uses terms that have discipline, that have akhlaq. This is not using a word just for the sake of an actual touching. What's the evidence? Where are you going to come up with an argument to support this opinion? They said simple. The Prophet ﷺ, every time he would go for salah, he would actually kiss his wives before going to salah. And certainly to kiss your wife actually means you're going to do a touching. And they say that Aisha said that he was basically kissing them before going to salah. The different sahabiyat, his wives actually said that, and therefore this is to support this opinion. The third opinion, Malikis and Hanbalis, they said, all right, we agree with you that this is relating to an actual touching, but we won't completely agree with you on the different stages of touching. What do you mean by that? I said, what we mean by that is when a touch is basically going not as far as an exaggerated touch, meaning that they basically reach the climax of a sexual touch, but we're actually speaking about the beginning stages. So basically a lustful touch. Any lustful touch, they said, no, no, no. We're talking about in situations where an actual secretion to substances, fluids have actually happened, then in that situation, that would require renewing the wudu. They all said, we already know that. We already agree on that. But we're here debating on whether that basically is the final thing. We agree that if there's a discharge of some kind of a fluid, that nullifies the wudu, but we're just wondering if the touching, just the actual touch, an innocent touch, on whether that breaks the wudu. So the Hanbalis and Malikis, they, no, just an actual touch. We agree that with the Hanafis, that doesn't break the wudu, and disagree with the Shafi'is that said that does break the wudu, and we regard what would be considered a wudu breaker in an incident of a man touching a woman is only when there is a secretion of a certain fluid. Okay? In other words, it was a lustful touch. Okay? All right. Just wanted to note that what is the preponderant ruling? Touching women and touching, of course, the wife, or whether it's a mahram or a non-mahram, that does not break the wudu. It's not a wudu breaker. Does that mean it's halal to actually shake a man's hand and a woman's hand? This is irrelevant. This is irrelevant. That's not an evidence to prove that it is permissible to shake a man's hand or a woman's hand. That is not permissible onto you, non-mahram, that is. This is irrelevant. We're talking about wudu here. And just by saying that it is not a wudu breaker, that's not an evidence that it is permissible to shake a man's hand or a woman's hand. All right. Let's continue and move on just in terms of what if I doubt? I'm not sure whether I did break my wudu or not. What should I do in that situation? Well, you would not leave your salah, or you would not consider yourself in a state of impurity unless you are sure. Let me explain that. So what do we mean by that? The Prophet ﷺ basically said, look at this hadith. إذا وجد أحدكم في بطنه شيئا فأشكل عليه أخرج منه شيء أم لا فلا يخرج من المسجد حتى يسمع صوتا أو يجد ريحا. Let's see the equivalent hadith. If any one of you feels any basically being in a state of ablution, or basically in that, and is doubtful whether anything like wind has issued from him or her, basically. And of course, he should not leave the masjid, or basically leave that when this is a metaphor to basically leave salah or reperform their wudu unless they hear a sound or basically sense a smell. All right. So, what is that supposed to mean? There is a general wording or a general legal maxim. It basically has been derived from this hadith. Al-yaqinu la yazulu bishak. What does that mean? Whenever you are in doubt of something, you don't base your action based on doubt, but you basically base it based on what you're sure of. So, therefore, to be in doubt whether you did lose your wudu or not, you're not going to leave your prayer or the masjid unless you're actually sure of something. Just feeling bloated, just feeling having a stomach ache or whatever it is, that is not basically a sign that you had left your, or at least that you lost your wudu right there. All right, so those are basically the things that we basically had considered as wudu breakers, and just wanted to basically explain it for this chapter. Before we move on to the following chapter, any questions in regards to wudu breakers? So to summarize it, there's a major impurity and there's a minor impurity. Major impurity requires complete body wash. Minor impurity requires ghusl. Major impurity, such as one, producing semen, or at least reaching the climax of sexual desire, whether we're talking about wet dream, or whether we're talking about intercourse, or whether we're talking about masturbation, basically requires ghusl. 2, after finishing a period. 3, after finishing postpartum. Differences of opinions between scholars if the person had become Muslim, whether they have to make ghusl, or if the person basically, of course, for the minor impurity, let's go for the minor impurity now. For the minor impurity, number one, if a person basically has a direct wudu breaker, whether anything that exits from the pathways, and what we mean by pathways, basically the place of discharge for urine or place of discharge for feces. So in that situation, anything that exits from these areas, and if we're speaking about, of course, a direct wudu breaker, that would basically mean that the person had lost their wudu and they would have to redo their wudu. When we talk about major impurity, forgot to mention, and minor impurity, we're actually talking about ritual impurity here. All right, ritual impurity. All right. Another minor impurity that different scholars or scholars had differences of opinions on: 1, vomit; 2, sleep; 3, having some kind of a bleeding, let's say involuntary, of course, bleeding, or basically whether it's a nosebleed or whether it's a cut, a minor cut, major cut, etc. So in that situation, scholars, just to note, had differences of opinions about. Don't want to go in all the details, just wanted to, I guess, recap what we had said in terms of that. Let's go for the other part: ritual bathing and ahkam al-ghusl. If there are any questions, if somebody wants to unmute themselves, go ahead. You can unmute yourself and ask the question if there is. Okay, I guess no one had a question. Let's continue. So now for ghusl. When you, yes, they beautifully translated into ritual bathing, because when we're speaking about bathing, we're speaking about ghusl, we're actually talking about removing major impurity. Right? And of course, what's the evidence that you basically have to do do this type of ghusl when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَإِن كُنْتُمْ جُنُوبًا فَطَهَّرُوا. If you are in a state of janaba. What is the state of janaba? State of janaba is basically after reaching the climax of any sexual climax, whether due to a wet dream or intercourse, or whether that was due to masturbation, then in that situation, that would be considered in a state of janaba in where the person is supposed to be taking a complete shower. All right, making a complete shower. And here's the ayah right there in English. And if you're in a state of janaba, I guess I would have actually tried to explain that, then purify yourselves. And of course, when we say purify yourselves, the ahadith had actually explained what it means to purify oneself. All right, and certainly there are 6 things in relationship to that. Number 1, if we're talking about basically the secretion of many, which in English, for a woman doesn't produce semen, a man does, but in Arabic they just use the word many for men and women basically reaching the climax. All right, so whether that was during of course a person is awake or whether the person is asleep, in that situation, if the person felt some sort of pleasure, basically of course it comes up with pleasure. But if the person had an illness and they're constantly producing that, then in that situation, that illness would not require them to make a complete shower each and every single time. So if we're talking about an illness, there was a documentary that I was watching in where this woman is it's a nerve, something wrong with the nerves, in where the woman is going through complete it's really a rather strange illness, but she's constantly going through I guess this climax of her sexual desire, and it's basically an illness. In that situation, does she have to redo her ghusl pretty much every couple minutes or every day or etc.? The answer is no. She would be considered as ashab al-a'dhar and therefore does not need to redo her wudu or redo her ghusl every single time. All right, of course this is an illness, this is not normal whatsoever, it's a nerve issue. All right, if of course we're speaking about during a sleep or of course what is called a wet dream, then in that situation they would have to redo their wudu. All right, what if situations in where of course an ejaculation in where we're speaking about not a complete penetration but a partial penetration? So whether a partial penetration, it doesn't have to be a complete one, that basically requires ghusl. What if an ejaculation did not actually happen, even if the man didn't completely reach the climax, or even if the woman didn't reach the climax, just a partial penetration? We're not talking about, sorry, I'm going to be really explicit here, but this is basically speaking about ahkam al-Islam here, so this is nothing to be shy about. We're talking about, of course, penetration. We're not talking about a finger here, but we're actually talking about an actual penetration, even if it's partial penetration to mean, of course, penis penetration. Even if it's partial, it requires ghusl for both. Even if they didn't reach the climax, they changed their mind, they didn't continue, yes, that would still require ghusl. What is the evidence? The Prophet ﷺ actually said, إِذَا جَلَسَ بَيْنَ شُعَابِهَا الْأَرْبَعِ ثُمَّ مَسَّ الْخِتَانِ الْخِتَانِ فَقَدْ وَجَبَ الْغُسْلِ. مَسَّ الْخِتَانُ الْخِتَانِ is basically that piece of it in where if the word khitan is basically that khitan is, it can be meaning to the area of circumcision. It could also mean basically the private part. So if the two private parts basically touch, in other words, a penetration happens, then the Prophet ﷺ actually said, then ghusl is required. Then ghusl is mandatory. All right, so just the actual penetration, and here whether an actual ejaculation happened, reached the climax, or didn't reach the climax, this is basically still requiring ghusl. All right. So just wanted to, here we go. So you basically wanted to say it in, I guess, in this language. Okay. The other part is Islam will kafir. I want you to look at this one. Here we go. This is basically, here we go. When anyone sits amidst four parts of the woman and the circumcised parts of the genitals touches each other, a ritual bath becomes obligatory. So basically, yeah, that's a nice translation. All right. All right, let's continue. The other part is in embracing Islam. When a disbeliever embraces Islam, there are differences of opinions whether they are required to make a ghusl or not. Just to note that, because this is very common where people would think that right away and that all scholars actually required ghusl. Not all scholars agreed on that, in where, of course, the Prophet ﷺ, we had a number of different Sahaba, they embraced Islam, and the Prophet ﷺ had sometimes ordered them to redo their ghusl basically, and others did not do a ghusl. So that's where some scholars actually said, no, it would be required to do ghusl if they went into a state that requires redoing their ghusl. In other words, they had they were in a state of janaba, then they became Muslim. Then in that situation, we would say, well, since you're in a state of janaba, redo your ghusl, go do a ghusl and come back if you want to learn how to pray and all of that. All right. Of course, a lot of scholars actually said it is liked and not necessarily obligatory. Let's see the other part. You just wanted to mention that one. Didn't want to go in details of all the evidences because there's so much to cover. All right. The other piece, of course, death. If a person is basically to die, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Ya Rabbi, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us husn al-khatima. Allahumma ameen. If a person is to die, and of course, we're not talking about a martyr. A martyr is not to be washed or even shrouded. They would basically be buried in their own clothes and not even washed. All right. But if a person is to die, it is obligatory, or at least let's call it a communal obligation, in where to basically shroud them, wash them, is a communal obligation called fard kifaya, and therefore we would basically have to wash the dead in that situation. All right, so this is one thing. Menstruation and postpartum bleeding. All right, the fifth cases that require ghusl, and the Prophet ﷺ basically tells that Sahabiya, فَإِذَا أَقْبَلَتْ حَيْضَتُكِ فَدَعِ الصَّلَاةِ وَإِذَا أَدْبَرَتْ فَاغْسِلِي عَنْكِ الدَّمَ ثُمَّ صَلِّي. Pause right here for a second. I want you to look at right there. This hadith is actually revealed, or sorry, is actually narrated in Bukhari, in Muslim, and of course, you will find a similar hadith in all the books of hadith, all the books of sunan, all the books of fiqh. This is something that all the Muslim scholars had unanimously agreed, that if a woman gets her period, that she basically does not pray while she's on her period. And this is basically explained by the Prophet ﷺ, and the Sayyidah Aysha even said, we were ordered to redo our fast and not redo our prayer. This is the Sayyidah Aysha. Basically, this is considered as marfu'a, to mean that Sayyidah Aysha was not getting it out of her own idea, her own explanation, but she said that we were ordered. In other words, the Prophet ﷺ was the one that was giving her the instruction how to embrace her rituals, how to embrace her salah, how to embrace it in relationship to the different changes in the body. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, basically out of mercy, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows the pains, knows the different things that you're going through while you're on your period. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically had basically removed a number of different rituals that you don't need to do while you're on your period. So if there are brothers, I hope they understand that when a woman is going through her period, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically asked her to leave her salah and leave even fasting, even though they were considered as considered as the pillars of Islam. If the pillars of Islam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asked women to basically not do them, then I would hope that the men, and of course, would understand that during those situations, that it is basically part of a rahmah. This is part of mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that you would help your wife during those days at home and help her, whether it's in washing dishes, whether it's in cleaning around the house, etc., because her body is already going through a lot by the witness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that she's not even praying, that she's not even doing major pillars in Islam during those times, because her body needs some rest. Enough said. وَإِذَا أَدْبَرَتْ, and if that period day ends, فَاغْسِلِي عَنْكِ الدَّمْ, then wash away basically the, here فَاغْسِلِي عَنْكِ الدَّمْ, meaning the remaining, if there's anything remaining in, of course, on the body, etc. So basically do a complete ritual wash and then pray. And of course, the ayah also says, فَإِذَا تَطَهَّرْنَ, and if they basically had completed their period, and of course, some scholars basically note, can a woman be intimate with her husband if her period ended, but yet she did not take a complete shower yet? Scholars had differences of opinions on that. Why? Because of this word that my cursor is pointing to right here. So, first opinion said tataharn. They said, well, what that means is literally, it actually means tahara is the root, which basically means to purify. So the first group of scholars, they said tataharun basically means that the period had ended. The second group of scholars, they said no. It actually involves tataharun, in where here's a shadda. And what we understand from this shadda is that there is an exaggeration in the actual embracement of purification. And what that would mean is that a stage, the first stage, is basically the completion of the period. In other words, she completed her period. And then the second stage is basically to take a complete shower before he can be intimate. So what if she did istinja, basically washed the area, all right, washed the area we're talking about, just did istinja and didn't do a complete shower? Differences of opinions between scholars. How do we do ghusl is the question. So now, the first stage of ghusl, if a person wanted to do ghusl, all right, there's a sunnah piece of it, and there's, let's call it the least piece of it, the stage in where you're considered complete ghusl. Complete ghusl, in where if you basically, here you go under the shower, boom, turn on your basically water, you're underneath it, and you basically just make sure wash your private parts, and you're just letting the water flow, your ghusl is valid. Okay? Now, the sunnah, though, if you wanted to go farther, all right, then we would say, well, we need to get more details in where to put in a couple items to stay away from all the differences of opinions. Number one is basically having the intention. What do we mean by the intention? You're not here just, sitting under this water, basically just to remove, I guess, the sweat, but no, you're actually there with the intention that you are going through a ritual bathing. Okay. And the sunnah is to basically start with Bismillah. Okay. Then what? Well, then wash your hands and wash your private part. And of course, when we're speaking about washing it thrice, scholars actually had differences of opinions on the word thrice, on whether thrice is basically to mean literally three times, or whether thrice is basically to mean you're letting the water flow enough. If you're not recognizing the amount, then just recognize by three times it should have been a complete water flow. And number two is that once you wash your private part, then basically do a complete wudu. So after washing the private part, do a complete wudu. This is the sunnah, but and of course we're just here going into the sunnah. All right. Then of course after doing a complete wudu, do now start with the head and basically do a complete. So you're basically shampooing your hair, completely shampooing your hair, and then you're letting all the body basically get the water flowing on the rest of the body. All right. So whether this was a woman or a man. Now, what if, okay, couple things here. What if it's a man or a woman, and of course they basically had all these braids? Do they have to unbraid their hair or not? Differences of opinions between scholars in that regard. The differences of opinions, they went in details. Some scholars differentiated between the major impurity after a period and a major impurity basically after intimacy. Other scholars, they said there's no difference between a major impurity because of a period and a major impurity because of intimacy. They said it's both the same thing. You're doing ghusl. Why would they actually have differences of opinions in the first place? So the reason to it is because the Prophet ﷺ actually said in a hadith, when she asked when that Sahabiya asked the Prophet ﷺ, and she said, I've got, lots of hair and it's really hard for her to unbraid it and all of that. So the Prophet ﷺ said, إنما يكفيك أن تحثي عليه ثلاث حثيات. It's enough for you to let three handfuls of water, just pour it over, three handfuls of water, just put it over your head, and you should be done. On whether that basically is including women during cycle or whether that is only during or after intimacy. Just wanted to mention that. So in case of unbraiding the hair, Sayyida Aisha, Amr ibn al-As, when he was in Egypt, he was basically giving fatwa that women had to unbraid their hair for the ghusl. Sayyida Aisha responds, shouldn't he just order them to just shave off their heads? And of course, a rather different response, but she said, then explained, and she said, I would actually be intimate with the Prophet ﷺ, and I would not unbraid my hair. So that was basically to explain that piece of it, in where because of the hardship they do not have to unbraid their hair. Of course, would you really want to do that for, if you're just going to leave your hair braided, it's definitely going to, I guess, produce fungus and a lot of these different things. I mean, that's a different hygiene reason. We're here, saying the limit from the Islamic perspective. But would you really not want to I guess, unbraid your hair and leave your hair wet, because that's really going to definitely attract mold in your hair, and definitely not a good thing to have. And then you're going to start getting the dandruff and all of that. But at the end of the day, I'll just leave it at the basis of Islamic rulings and how far and what hygiene at least the colored sisters actually do to make sure that their hair is not getting molded and all of that. So they would know what they're doing. So I'll just leave it at that. All right. So the part that some scholars actually said that no, there has to be a thorough wash, in where they actually use this hadith. تحت كل شعرة جنابة فاغسلوا الشعر وأنقوا البشر. This hadith is basically the basis for those scholars that said that no, you basically have to do what is called isbaghul ghusl. What is isbaghul ghusl? In where you have to make sure that each and every single pore within your body, it basically has to be touched with water. And of course, we're talking about the exterior, or not. We're not asking you to cleanse the interior ones. Of course, we're talking about exterior. So, and that's why basically some scholars actually had differences of opinions on whether you have to even wash your mouth or cleanse your nostrils for a complete ghusl or not, because they had differences of opinions on whether that is part of the exterior part of the body, or whether interior part of the body, or whether it's part of the face or not. So just wanted to keep that in mind, and where, yes, do we have to wash and all of that. So let's see here. The menstruating or the women in state of postnatal bleeding has to undo her hair braids or pigtails when taking a ritual bath. Even though, yes, he does say that, but I want you to keep in mind there are differences of opinions between scholars. So I am aware, the book, but of course the book sometimes wants to make things, I guess, let's just call it summarized, but because of course we're going into details, so I'm just letting you know that there are differences of opinions between scholars. Now, another sunnah to do during shower, in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Prophet actually says, inna Allah hayyun ستير يحب الحياء والستر فإذا اغتسل أحدكم فليستتر. The Lord Almighty, the Prophet says, the Lord Almighty is a bashful one and loves covering. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves bashfulness and covering. So if you were to take a shower, then cover. So just to keep that in mind, that it is basically the sunnah, and simply, of course, obligatory, that we would not, of course, in fact, there is another hadith where the Prophet ﷺ actually said that it is not permissible, or something like that, that men would bathe in front of each other and basically expose their body parts in front of each other. So what happens in fitness rooms and all these different areas of public swimming pools and all of that is basically haram and not permissible. It is mandatory to cover and not expose, of course, the private parts, even if it's men to men and women to women. So this is it, inshallah, for the day. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer the questions, inshallah. And I hope it was a long one, wasn't it? And too detailed. I know, and too explicit.
Sheikha, I have a question regarding girls, teenage girls. So like, if I mean, I know about wet dreams, I guess in general. Is it possible for girls to experience wet dreams? I mean, I know they can have, depending on what they, what they imagine and what they see. And in that case, like, how do we, if we're teaching them, let's say we're teaching a group of girls in our local community, how do we teach like, how should we explain it that if they feel a certain type of arousal, they need to take a shower?
Right. So, of course, when we're speaking about girls that had never had a relationship before, it's really hard for them to really understand what an actual, I guess, climax of a desire feels like, unless they actually went. And of course, it is common, and I guess it's important to mention that doing and engaging in some form of masturbation is basically something that is a lot more common than you would expect. It's actually a lot more common than you expect, and especially during our times. And of course, when we say masturbation. I'm not necessarily talking about engaging in any form of detail of it. I'm just talking about experiencing some level of arousal, some level of pleasure due to touching the genitals is basically something that even children, even if they did not reach the age of puberty, they do recognize. So we do see that, and I do actually get a lot of women, freaking out and telling me my son, who's only probably 5 years old, has a habit of touching himself, or just always, even when they're sleeping, etc. This is completely common, and this is absolutely, in where even children, and absolutely common that that women who would, as mothers, they would freak out. What am I supposed to do? Should I hit them? Should I this? And I would say no. If you hit them, you would basically just somehow make them think that there is this area that basically is an area that I want to cover from you. I don't want you to explore. So part of it is really them exploring their body parts. And certainly we want to make sure that they're not harming themselves. So explaining to them that just because you're feeling something, this area is basically an area of najasa, explaining it to them from that area. This is an area of najasa. You don't want to touch the area, smell the poop, it stinks, smell the pee, yeah, it stinks. So therefore, yeah, you don't want to put your hand where you're touching an area that basically has najasa in it, and then you're probably going to be eating. It's disgusting. Wash your hands. So once you eliminate and you explain it from that angle, you take away all the different fears in terms of, yes, that there is some kind of a fear from this area, etc. And of course, you're also explaining, especially to the girls, because of course, a number of different openings for them. You're explaining to them, well, just like you don't put your hand inside your mouth, we tell you don't put your hand inside your mouth because you're basically, this is inside of your inner body. You definitely don't want to, not because you've got you don't put your hand and stick stuff inside your ears. You don't stick things inside your nose. You don't stick things inside your mouth. You don't stick things inside your eyes. Therefore, just to keep your body healthy, same thing. There's another opening that I want you to keep in mind. Don't stick anything inside, and that way you could stay healthy. So just teach them that to recognize the different openings in their body and how they relate to it. In terms of, I guess, explaining it to the girls, that if you feel a pulse, that's the easiest way to explain it to them. If you feel a pulse in that area and you feel some form of a pleasure, or if there's a secretion of any liquid with a pulse that is basically coming with a pulse, that's a way for you to know that you are required ghusl. So we're speaking about girls that reach the age of puberty. All right. So that's how you would explain it to them. So basically from that sense, rather than go in explicit details, because sometimes if you were to go in explicit details, some parents are not, I guess, are not ready to teach their children this and their daughters this information. So you want to make sure that you're also embracing the parents' choices and not necessarily, I guess, exposing the girls to some information that that certain parents or certain girls. So sometimes, let's say we're putting 12-year-olds together. Not all the 12-year-old girls have gotten a period, or were really, let's say, getting even close to that stage. So not all of them are at that stage. So you want to make sure that you're not exposing them to too much, and at the same time you're giving them an amount of information that is enough to prepare them for that stage. So just, I guess, just a note on how we can explain this.
Thank you, Shaykha. Jazakallah khair.
Of course, for boys, it's a little different. Boys are usually, I would say, you know, I guess they're more open about it. Girls are more shy. the boys, they would be giggling and it's like they recognize a lot of things a lot more than girls, maybe because of the way their anatomy is, in where they're a lot more, I guess, open to talk about it amongst each other than girls. Girls, they would talk about it in private. They're sharing some information here and there. Each one is sharing something, but that's where a parent comes in to make sure that they're giving them the right information, because if you don't give them that information, they do recognize that there is some information, there is some secrecy, there is something here, because they definitely sense it. So they will go online to search for it, and without you realizing, I did actually have a couple cases where an addiction to porn actually started at age 12 or at age 11, when, of course, the parents basically did not think that they had this curiosity to search about this, and it started out with a curiosity until later on it became an addiction. So you really want to be careful in how you educate your children. And of course, if you don't educate them, they will actually have their curiosity take them elsewhere without you realizing. So you really have to make sure that you're helping your let's call them adult to be, get the education, whether about tahara or about their body or about the development that their body is going through. And at the same time, you're mentoring them for, and let me call it, an educated and a disciplined and a wise way in how they would recognize their new stage, and at the same time recognize the responsibilities that actually come with it, whether we're talking about a ritual responsibility or whether we're talking about a responsibility in terms of course, the interaction with the other sex, or whether we're talking about the responsibility of gazing and what they're looking at, or the interaction even with the person's physical body. Is masturbation haram? There are differences of opinions between scholars in that regards. Let me just pause right here for a second. When we're speaking about this issue, it's definitely a very sensitive issue, but let me explain a number of different things. Number one is that the ayah in general, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that in terms of course, فَمَنِ ابْتَغَى وَرَاءَ ذَلِكَ فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْعَادُونَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically says, وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ لِفُرُوجِهِمْ حَافِظُونَ, that those, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala praises the mu'mineen, those that preserve and guard their private parts, except from their wives and their concubines. Then whoever goes beyond that, then that they had committed an aggression or a transgression. Okay, basically transgress the limit. All right, so فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْعَادُونَ. So the first opinion that scholars they considered is that, number one, with this ayah, this generalized statement in where whoever goes beyond wife and husband relations, so in other words, the husband can masturbate his wife, the wife can masturbate her husband, but if it goes outside of that, in where that would be considered basically going beyond the limit. So the scholars that basically considered that going beyond the limit, so whether we're talking about vibrators, whether we're talking about sex toys, whether we're talking about masturbation, that, or whether we're talking about, I don't know, pornography, etc., that is considered, or even if we're talking about massages, etc., outside of husband and wife relations, that is basically considered as haram and basically transgress the limit. So that's the first opinion. Okay, the first opinion basically outside, and that's we're here, anything that's outside of husband and wife relations. When we're speaking about what about in situations where the person is in a strong desire. We're not talking about massages here. We're not talking about, toys. We're actually talking about just an actual masturbation. All right. So for the Hanbali madhab, which is really, especially during our times today, where fitna is really rampant, it is a considerable opinion. And the Hanbali madhab, they regarded that not that it is permissible, but it is a better alternative to zina. A better alternative to zina. So in situations where zina is possible, or the person is fearing zina, they don't necessarily have to commit it, but where they're really feeling that urge, and that situation, of course, we would definitely say, well, the alternative, if the person is not capable of getting married, then the alternative, in where it's lesser evil to actually masturbate, whether we're speaking about male or female here. All right. And we're just, laying out the different situations in where this could be an alternative for some. And I would say to exaggerate and only lay out that it is haram and completely haram and all, and the person is held accountable and etc., and not understand the circumstances. And even that Hanbali opinion right there, especially in the time of fitna, you can actually be putting the person inside a worse fitna without you realizing. So, and of course, that doesn't mean if a person is masturbating, that does not mean that it is permissible to watch porn whatsoever. And this is not talking about vibrators and sex toys and all of that. Sorry, but this is actually just talking about just the piece of masturbation itself. So just wanted to explain this piece of it. Sorry if it was, I guess, too explicit, but I think it's important to explain it to the sisters. I'm just laying out those differences of opinions. And of course, we do have different cases, different circumstances. So just wanted to lay that. Can a husband and a wife masturbate themselves? Yes, they can. There's no differences of opinions between scholars in that regards. In where, what if basically she couldn't complete, and of course it usually takes longer for the woman, basically because of her anatomy. Took her longer than the man. Can he basically masturbate her to complete, I guess, her need or her desire? The answer is yes, he can definitely do that. Can she do it to herself while basically they're in the state and etc.? Can she do it to herself? Differences of opinions between scholars in that regards. Some did actually regard it as permissible since it's still within the process, and that it's not, of course, inducing the new process, but it's within the process together. Just wanted to mention that. Sorry about that if it's too explicit, and sorry if somebody is underage. I hope not. I'm assuming that whoever is here, making sure that it's basically not an underage thing. Any questions in that regard? Sorry if I was too explicit. I guess you're all shyer than me right now. So this is it, inshallah. We'll see you all next class, inshallah. And assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته. جزاكم الله خير sister.
ربي يحفظكم يا ربي، ربي يحفظك.